Welcome to Careers in Discovery, where you'll meet scientists who've forged outstanding careers in biotech and hear about what they've learned along the way. This podcast is brought to you by Singular, building brilliant biotechs. This week on Careers in Discovery, I'm really pleased to be joined by Ross Breckenridge of Arjuna Therapeutics. Ross, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks very much.
Fabulous to see you. And I'm really interested to learn more about Arjuna to start with. And I love the tagline that you've put together of very small molecules, very big impact. I'd love to hear more about that as we kick off.
Sure. So this whole story started actually when I was living in the US in the Bay Area, and I'm a firm believer in. Well, I'm a clinical pharmacologist at heart, so everything's about dose, and the same goes for nationality. So the correct dose of being English is not 100%. Likewise, the correct dose of being Californian isn't 100%. So while I was living in the Bay Area, I was trying to increase my Californianness. So I joined a CEO group. Which just such a great thing to do, because it instantly gave me friends for life, and the way that it works in these groups is kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you all sit around and emote and sort of talk about the challenges you're having in a safe space. Except unlike Alcoholics Anonymous, you usually go to the pub afterwards. So one of the people that I met there it still is the head of the American branch of a Spanish chemical startup. It was one of his side hustles, and they were developing a novel form of material that had been developed at this university, one of the very old universities in Spain, the University of Santiago de Compostela. They developed a new form of material made from metal atoms. So these don't exist in nature, and rather than being a sort of a bulk metal that we're familiar with, these are small molecules. You persuade these atoms by application of specific amounts of energy to form covalent bonds with each other, and you then get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 atom molecules that have completely unique properties. And these have been developed for a number of really very cool indications outside biology, but one of our scientific founders, it turns out, is the professor of oncology at the university. And he'd been screening these molecules for many years and had found that some of them had really quite surprising and profound anti-cancer properties.
Okay.
So they asked me, because I was at the time I was CEO of a biotech startup there. They asked me, well, what experiments do you think we need to do as sort of bridging experiments? And I suggested a bunch, and then a few months later, Darren, who's now on my board, came and said, "Well, they've done the experiments, and here are the results." And that was very cool, because that stuff normally doesn't happen in life, as we know. There's normally like a way sort of conversation. And it was about that time that my wife was saying, "Look, we've had 3 years of living in the Bay Area. I need to get back because we've got children, and the education system in America, there's a whole separate podcast, is just different and a bit weird and not great. And the other thing is that she's a very senior lawyer for the UK government. Okay. And so she was really rather unsatisfied by the jobs that were available to her in the States. So we came back, and when the Spaniards heard I was coming back, they said, "Well, why don't you start the Biotech up?" So we did, and that's what I've spent the last 4 years or so doing, is starting this up. And it's kind of nice starting a company up from scratch, because I get to decide things like the company culture, which is something that I always thought was nonsense, actually, until when I was in academia. I just thought this is this sort of crap that people in business talk about. Right. But actually it's really, really important, and developing the sort of heuristics within our group to cope with all of the problems that every biological experiment can throw up. And biotechs are essentially a series of biological experiments. Being able to do that at the start, I think, was incredibly valuable, and hopefully the fruit will be born in the years to come.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I could spend the entire podcast talking about culture with you, of course.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, no,
I
I
think
mean, I have to say, if anybody had said to me sort of 5 years ago that I would agree with you, I would have told them to go and see a psychiatrist. But I completely agree with you.
yeah, I think it's one of those, isn't it? That as soon as you see a great culture, as soon as you're in there, suddenly it makes sense. It doesn't.
Completely
It's
right.
very hard to explain to people who've not experienced it.
Yeah.
Um, but
But
yeah,
it's much easier, to be honest, if you've been in a group or a company or even an academic group that's got a really bad culture. People understand what it is. If it's bad, if you know, if people screaming at each other and resigning and are miserable, then it's easy to explain. But if it's one of those things that if it all works, it's kind of invisible, but it doesn't happen by accident.
no.
So that's one of the big lessons that I've learned over the last few years, and it's yeah. So it you know, as we get older, we're sort of a synthesis of all of the things that's happened to us.
Yeah, true. Well, we will come back to that. So thinking about Arjuna and the approach that you're taking, then, so it's come out of the university. There's an increasing number of small molecule oncology programs around, and it seems that there are sort of new mechanisms or new potential mechanisms being discovered regularly that can be treated with small molecules. Tell us a bit about your angle and your approach and.
Sure. So our first molecule. So to take a step back, our pipeline. We've got a number of molecules. They all have different biological mechanisms. The thing that unites them is the fact that they belong to this class of chemical. So they have the same physicochemical properties.
Okay.
So these molecules are tiny. They are extremely stable. We think they're going to be orally deliverable. Wow. and the other thing is that they're a small molecule, so it's very precise to make them. I've spent the last 20 years and innumerable patents to protect and figure out how to actually make these molecules. We think in the end that our GMP manufacturing is actually going to be relatively, I never want to use the word simple, but it's going to be relatively straightforward,
right?
But quite precise. So it's nowhere near the horror show of trying to make a protein, an engineered protein, for example. So it's an order of magnitude easier and cheaper than that. So our first molecule is actually a catalyst.
Okay.
So there aren't any drugs that we're aware of that are actually properly chemically catalytic. Well, of course, enzymes are catalysts by definition, but that's a sort of a separate question. So what the molecule does is in the right milieu, which is the mitochondrion, it will catalyze at a threshold level of superoxide, which is a charged oxygen species that is the byproduct of energy generation. If there's a threshold high level of that, it will basically remove all of the antioxidant defenses very quickly within 5 minutes in the mitochondrion, triggering cell. So exposure needs to be a very short period of time. We've got it down to about 5 minutes in cells where we can put the molecule on and wash it off. And essentially all of the antioxidants get wiped out. And you get a pulse of hydrogen peroxide in the mitochondrion that's generated by the mitochondrion itself, because its antioxidants have been removed. And it triggers cell death. And the really cool thing about this is that this is a part of biology that people have understood separates cancer from non-cancer cells for a long time. Yes. But it's been impossible to leverage, because if you use a pharmacological inhibitor, it is as effective in a cancer cell and a non-cancer cell. If you use a catalyst, because of this threshold effect, it'll only be active in a certain proportion of cancers. So it doesn't work in every cancer.
No.
Doesn't work in every patient in some of the cancers that we're looking at, which we're actually delighted about, because if we were selling Domestos, we were selling, Americans call it Clorox toilet paper, it would work in every cancer cell. The fact that it doesn't means that there is what one of our collaborators very grandly called a biological truth, a certain biological truth to it.
Yeah. Okay.
So the molecule is actually quite specific. There's a very large therapeutic window if we give it to the cancers that are sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out the cancers that are sensitive are the ones with the most abnormal mitochondrial metabolism, and they're the worst ones. So they're the KRAS mutant cancers, metastatic cancer, primary brain cancers. So this isn't in the end, we don't think this is going to be a niche product. We think this is going to be a product that's applicable across a large number of the really horrendous tumors that patients have at the moment.
Yeah, I see. Okay. And I can see how how this caught the attention of the pharmacologist in you.
It's a very weird thing. I mean, these molecules are weird. They diffuse freely. So they're not nanomolecules. They're smaller than that. It's 100 femtograms across, femtometers across. So it's a thousandth of a nano is a femto. And the molecule will cross the blood-brain barrier as if it's not there.
Okay.
You can cool cells down to 4 degrees, and AG5 will still get into the mitochondrion. So it's entirely passive. So it's not targeted in the sense that it will accumulate at one area, but it sort of goes everywhere. And actually, for a lot of the cancers that we're thinking about, that's actually good news, because cancers spread very early. You think about lung and pancreatic cancer. It's not the primary that kills you; it's the spread. And the other thing that's really important about this, I mean, we've spent a lot of time and effort working out the pharmacokinetics of the drug, how the body actually eliminates it, and it's completely eliminated by the liver. So it doesn't accumulate, and it's got a half-life in rodents of about 12 or 14 hours. So it's actually quite convenient in terms of drug-like properties, and it's completely eliminated. So there isn't this nagging doubt about filling people up with a toxic chemical and having problems later on. So we're now at the stage where we can kind of work out the dosing strategy in our animal models with respect to the tumors that we're looking at. And obviously the step after that is figuring out how we dose it in humans. And with luck and an infusion of investment money, we aim to be doing that towards the end of next year.
Fair enough. So I assume that's where you're spending most of your time at the moment, is preparing for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the life of a biotech CEO, any biotech CEO that says that they're not raising money is deluded and should be doing a different job. I mean, the job, even as soon as you close one round, you're starting raising for the next. So it's a money hungry business. And you spend a lot of time, at the stage that we're at, you kind of need believers in your project. So the investors that we've got are real believers, and as the amounts of money that you need in investment rounds go up, the burden of proof goes up. So we're speaking to some incredibly sophisticated investors at the moment, and they're asking for quite specific bits of data which we're generating, and that's great. I mean, we love the fact that the people that we're speaking to are, they understand what we're doing.
Yes.
And I think we'll look back at the last few years of the biotech world and think about the malign influences of dumb money. If you have dumb money coming in, actually it's in some ways it's harder work than having sophisticated money.
Yes.
Because in general, people who've made their money as investment bankers think that by shouting at people, things work better, and that's just not the way that biology works, as we know.
No, absolutely. Yes. So we'll come back to Arjuna and talk a bit more about the last 4 years as well, and the progression of the business. But I'm keen to go back a bit further than that, back to the start for you, Ross, and for you, why science? Why healthcare? Why this career for you in the first place, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, in common with a lot of people, I guess, who go into medicine, I grew up in a medical household. Mm-hmm. My dad was a doctor, and he was a scientist and a doctor as well. And he was just enthusiastic to the point of insanity. And I remember really very well one year he came back from a conference that he was at in the States, and he sat down with me, and I was about 13, I think, or 14. And he sat down with me and said, look, I've just heard something that's going to change the world. And he told me about recombinant DNA, which at the time was just sort of reaching prime time. So about when Biotech was being founded. And he was, you know, he made some very, very important contributions. So he was the guy that figured out the drug metabolism of warfarin, for example.
Right. Okay.
And he and a couple of his buddies at the Hammersmith were the first people to describe insulin resistance in humans. So, you know, he was a big guy. And he ended up becoming the inaugural chair of the MHRA in the UK.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Later. So he, you know, I went through medicine with a rather conspicuous surname, sort of in his shadow completely. And it turned out his brother was in a similar position in the surgical world. So medicine is complicated. There's the medics and the surgeons. So whenever I was a medical student and I was doing a surgical attachment, most of the people there knew my uncle, and everybody knew my dad on the medical side. So you know, it was a you know, one of those difficult kind of positions. But anyway, so the thing that I'd always thought about science first rather than medicine.
Yes.
And at the time of university applications, it seemed to me like medicine was a very good way of doing science. And in some ways I was right, but in other ways, in other ways, you know, I was kind of wrong, because a lot of medicine, as you learn medicine, a lot of it is still rather 19th century.
Right.
I mean, I get quite bitter when I think about the productive years of my life that I spent rooting through someone's dead grandmother on the dissection table, or learning the Latin names for the various bits of gristle. And, you know, I mean, it's the same thing. It's sort of Leonardo da Vinci territory of what medical students are for. And surprisingly, they kind of still do it, which is insane. But on the other hand, what medicine does give you is a bit more of a holistic view of the body, how it works, you know, and especially when you actually get to be at the business end of medicine, looking after patients. I mean, I think the perspective that you get there in the end, if you're sort of trying to develop new medicines, the perspective you get there is absolutely invaluable, because, you know, it means that patients aren't some sort of abstract. You know, at the moment, you know, the way that we sanitize such a lot of horrible stuff in medicine, you know, people talk about grade 3 side effect, which sounds fine, but what it means is somebody thinking they're going to die because they can't get off the toilet and they've got diarrhea the whole time. And, you know, one of my junior doctor jobs was looking after a ward full of patients who were getting cisplatin. And that tells you an awful lot about unmet need in therapeutics.
Right.
And, you know, explaining to people about the drugs. And the other thing, any doctor will tell you, doctors don't remember in general the patients that they cure. In general, they remember the ones that they lose, and they remember the conversations where you have to tell patients and their families, I'm sorry, there's just nothing available. And that's the sort of thing that is incredibly motivational with respect to wanting to do science.
Yes, that's it.
Otherwise, you know, you're just handing out pills. And, you know, I've got friends who lead very lucrative and for them very fulfilling lives, treating patients and being on Harley Street, and, you know, offering great service to their patients and great treatments. And very early on, I figured out that I would go mad if I did that, purely because there's so much in medicine where you actually either don't understand what's going on, or you can't intervene, or the treatments that you're given replace the disease with another syndrome, which is caused by the drugs. So it's, you know, the initial worry that I had, of course, as most people do when they go into medicine, is, God, by the time I'm a consultant, everything will have been sorted out. But it's kind of one of those things that the more we know about medicine, the less we understand, and the more we realize that we don't actually know.
Right, absolutely. So that led you to wanting to fill at least some of those gaps. Obviously, you can't fill all of them yourself, but
Yeah.
to find ones that you could impact.
That's right. And the great thing about medicine is it's such a broad church. You will always find a niche that you're interested in. And I mean, I always thought I was going to be an oncologist, actually. And then until I did my oncology job, which at the time, at the time that I did it, there weren't that many treatments that worked very well.
Right.
And it was such a miserable experience. I just thought, look, I can't see myself doing this. And I was thinking, well, what the hell am I going to do? Because all of my undergraduate research had been in cell cycle stuff. I'm interested in biochemistry. And then the next job I did was a cardiovascular job where the research people there sort of took the junior doctors under their wing and, really, it was a great model of how to get people interested in your field, actually. This is in Cambridge. A guy called Peter Weisberg, who ended up running the British Heart Foundation. And his group was, it really was very, very sort of stimulatory for somebody like me, in that they were thinking about big problems. There was lots of interesting science. And so in the end, I ended up doing a PhD after a few years of being a doctor. I did a PhD in quite basic science, actually, looking at development of heart muscle cells.
Right. Okay.
During embryogenesis, with respect to thinking, well, maybe we can persuade adult heart cells to either regenerate or not die, and so. That was kind of the start of doing rather more serious science than undergraduate stuff.
Yeah, I see. And then that led you to an academic career initially. From
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I got a so I was just finishing my PhD and I was thinking, well, what the hell am I going to do? And I ended up getting a phone call from Patrick Vallance, who was then the professor at UCL. And said, well, heard on the grapevine you're coming to the end of your PhD and you're thinking about what they call medical training, which when you're a medical training happens after when you're a registrar.
Right. Yes.
Training. So it's kind of one of those things you think when you're a doctor, you think when you become a doctor, you think, all right, I'm a doctor now, but you realize that all you've been taught to do is to understand the index of the dictionary, and you don't even know enough to be useful.
Right.
So it's pretty bad, actually. I remember that feeling. I was thinking, great, I'm a doctor. Oh man, I'm useless. So I ended up going down to London and meeting his team, and I'd always thought that I'd sort of stay in Cambridge because it's such a big, stimulating place. But actually, the opportunity there was to really go and do some very interesting medicine and work with a different set of really, really excellent people. So I ended up going down there.
And obviously, he's someone who's gone on and done incredible things in his career. I mean, were there things that you have stuck with you about working for him and in that group?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a very interesting thing because we've throughout my time there, there's always been regular dinners and drinks and things, and that continues actually. So it turns out him and Chris Whitty as well are sort of part of the sort of the bigger group. They've obviously had a rather interesting time of it over the last few years. I mean, God, the toll on him has just been insane. He had this high powered job at GSK for many years, and then ended up doing this as none of us really understood why he did it. And then thankfully it was him in post while all the shit was going on, and we now know having to resist all of the randomness from the politicians. So it's just a huge amount of admiration.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so you stayed in that academic world for some time after that, and progressed through the different levels, and spent a long time, I suppose, building that side of your career before moving into industry.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that.
I always smile when people call it industry, because it doesn't feel like an industry. It feels it's sort of a cottage industry in biotech. So yeah, I was So I had a lab, and we were looking at hypoxia, adaptation of hypoxia, and ways to influence how cells, especially in the heart, will tolerate low levels of oxygen. Because that's one of the main reasons that heart cells die. I got very interested in heart failure as a condition, and it was very interesting. I mean, there's such a lot of territoriality in medicine that the heart failure guys that I worked with were very unkeen for anybody other than catheter pushing cardiologists to look after heart failure patients. So there was, that's one of the things that holds medicine back, actually, is that it was determined, many years ago, which specialty will look after which patients, and it's rather difficult to break that. But one of the things that I did at UCL, which was probably the most useful thing that I did there, apart from teaching. I did a lot of teaching of undergraduates and started a master's course in drug development. Typically, it's the sort of thing you get told that you have to do, even if you don't know anything about it. So I was learning at the same time as running the course and getting external speakers in. But I was also chairman of the Use of Medicines Committee. The UCL hospitals spend about £100 million a year on medicines, and the inflation rate's about 10%. Although the budget doesn't go up by that. So the committee basically has to decide where the cash is spent and how to save money. And, it's just such an interesting challenge. And it was, so that was probably the most enjoyable, satisfying thing that I did, even though it was, hard work, and ended up getting letters from MPs complaining that we're not giving their constituent drug X or drug Y. But the funny thing is that when you get a couple of letters from MPs about the same drug, you realize that they've all been written by the same person, and that person is probably in a drug company.
Yes.
So there's quite a lot of that.
Yeah,
and on the side, I was also I've got some friends in the investment industry, and I was essentially stopping them investing in crazy stuff in biology, and ended up getting more interested in the whole idea of the sort of business side of capital allocation and how you how you actually use money to advance things commercially. So that was another sort of learning curve that I was lucky enough to be on. And I think I'm a firm believer that if you're lucky, you will always be on some interesting learning curves.
Yes, absolutely.
So, in some ways, I'm at the stage now where I'm at so many damn learning curves. It's quite uncomfortable sometimes. But again, I go back to thinking about my friends who are making huge amounts of money doing colonoscopies every Saturday morning. I'd much rather be me than them. And they live in nicer houses with nicer cars. But hey,
I think I always think this, if you're doing the CEO job well, then you're always going to be in territory you've never been in before, right? And that's a sign that you're doing a good job, actually. But
and the other thing is that I now look at my sort of entry into biotech as just thinking about how naive I was, and the things that I thought were important. Okay, they're important, the biology and patient selection, but actually the things I hadn't even thought about, things like manufacturing, turned out to be just so important. And so much of my time is spent thinking about speaking to manufacturing people and figuring out how we actually make this weird chemical into an actual drug. And I have to say, I kind of like it for some reason. I've got a German cousin who is he's a chemical engineer, and he did his PhD on how to get things to go through high pressure tubes without destroying chemicals. And at the time, I was just thinking, what a bloody waste of time. But now I understand how cool it is and how important it is, and how interesting the maths is that describes it all. So it's there's always something, and as Arjuna evolves, there's always some other learning curve that I need to step on, and there's always some other sort of thing that I realize I know very little about, so I have to hire some consultants, make sure I can ask the right questions, and then think about recruiting, a bigger team when we're better capitalized and need more bodies, right?
No, absolutely. And so the initial step, though, the initial transition over into biotech was Silver Creek, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
So tell us a bit about how that came about.
So that's a startup in San Francisco, and it was so I was basically helping a friend manage an investment in what turned out to be the parent company of Silver Creek. And initially, they were sort of looking for board members, and they said, well, why don't you join the board of this sort of company that we're spinning out. So I joined the board and had a couple of board meetings with the team there, and much to my surprise, they said, well, we need a CEO. Why don't you do it? And at the time, I was in a tenured post in London with a wife with a very high-powered legal career and 2 kids in school. So, in some respects, looking back, it is amazing that I managed to persuade everybody to decamp to San Francisco, but we did. And that was just the most intensely educational experience of my life by a long way. And of course, there's all the cultural stuff as well. I mean, we take it for granted that living in the US is like living in the UK, but it really isn't.
No,
business is very different as well, and the way that people relate to each other, etc. So that was just intensely rewarding and difficult, rewarding, fun, interesting, all of these things at once. So it was very cool.
What were your observations on the biggest differences? Because I think there's America and then there's California as well.
Oh yeah.
But what are the things that you spotted that were different out there?
Well, I mean, there are lots of things. So in particular in California, the relationship between companies and university is rather different. And I think a lot of it is certainly for the University of San Francisco is due to the scars that they have from Genentech, which was a traumatic birth for University of San Francisco. So Silver Creek had a relationship with the University of San Francisco, which was dysfunctional and difficult, but not sort of existential for the company. The other things are, the American way of doing business, and in some ways people there are slightly more formal. In other ways, they're rather informal. I introduced a management tool, which at the time was very surprising and revolutionary for the team, which was going to the pub on a Friday night. That well-known British thing. And actually, I think people found that when they were sort of relaxing and spending more time socializing with each other, and that this was sort of part of work rather than part of leisure, where you'd sit and have a beer and talk about work. They tend not to do that, which I found very interesting. Whereas in medicine, in the UK, it's the exact opposite. Anything bad happens, the team goes to the pub and you have a couple of beers and relax, and then you can have a talk where the sort of hierarchy is flattened. So there's that. The sort of relationship with board members there, I thought was a bit different to what we have in the UK, but a lot of that is I don't think is related to business. It's just related to the fact that British people tend to be a bit more diffident. And Americans a bit more upfront. And then there's the investment environment as well. And certainly in California, everything is dominated by how expensive everything is. And so, in some ways in the US, a lot of time you start with money and then figure out how to spend it on biology. Whereas in Europe, for better or worse, we tend to start with science and then build the science up and then fund it that way. And then, I've been thinking about, which is better, and I think there are pros and cons for both. And certainly there is an abundance of money in the American system, which there isn't in the European system. So in some ways, the European system is more efficient. But on the other hand, it would be we would be moving a lot quicker if we had had a lot more money up front. But on the other hand, would we be making better decisions? And would we have made decisions quickly because money needs to be spent?
Yes.
Rather than sort of going slowly because we're raising money in increments and understanding the molecule perhaps a little bit better. So it's an interesting thing, and what it's made me realize is that biology is not nationalistic at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so capital allocation really needs to be allocated in geographies where it's best spent. And I've become a firm believer in very early stage development needs to be done in Europe or somewhere with an ecosystem like Europe. I don't think there is anywhere else like it. But on the other hand, you then very rapidly need to transition into a US system where you have financial firepower and the levels of I don't know what the right word is. I guess aggression in some ways, but efficiency, aggression. Everything works there a lot quicker. Everything is set up, and the clinical trials that they do in the States are very, very, very much more expensive than we do in Europe, but they're quicker and more sort of efficient if you have enough money.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a lot of European biotech companies who are very promising that falter because they just can't raise enough money to go into the clinic, or they can't raise enough money to go into phase 2 or what have you, right? And that probably wouldn't have happened to those companies if they were American companies. In some cases, obviously, the drug doesn't work or the science isn't right or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think but then there's a real challenge when you have a company, because at that stage, I suppose a company is probably at least several dozen, if not a couple of hundred people getting towards. And so then transitioning that company to a US company becomes more challenging, right? So I guess it's an interesting hurdle to overcome.
No, I think you're exactly right. But on the other hand, if you're thinking about this at the start of the company rather than halfway through, it becomes much easier to think, well, okay, strategically, strategically meaning what is over the hill after the hill next, rather than just sort of thinking about what's in front of you. What would we do now that will make it easier later on? And I think that's actually been one of the nice things about starting the company up. I mean, okay, there's a lot of time that it's taken to do all this stuff, but we're in a position now where we have collaborators in the US and we have collaborators in Japan, which is an area, a geography that we're very, very interested in. And it takes time and energy and a bit of thinking to make sure that all of these things can be done in the future in a way that is going to be effective. And I think one of the things that I think people don't do enough of is just to think about things, is to just think things through. And that's the benefit of being the CEO, is that you have to force yourself to do something else, to think about what's going on. And there is a danger that you think that you need to be doing 8 hours of Zoom calls a day, otherwise you're not working. And in fact, the opposite is true. It's the gaps in between the notes that are the bits that make music, and it's the gaps in between the timetable activities, I think, that enable strategic thinking and enable the brain to be actually activated. So that's been one of the very few advantages of lockdown, right? There's a lot more. We've all had a lot more time to think.
Absolutely, but I think it's a really important point, is that there is people who take on CEO positions typically have built quite successful careers, right? They've typically worked hard to get to that point, and they've been high achievers. And so I think you almost have a sort of a tendency to make yourself busy, right? Because that's what you're used to. And I think there's you've touched on it there. I think particularly the first time that you find yourself in these situations, there's a guilt associated with not being busy.
Yeah,
and
right.
you sort of feel like you're skiving, and everyone
Yeah,
else
no,
is
no,
going to
no,
notice that
totally.
you're skiving.
Yeah,
All
yeah,
the days.
you're exactly right. And the other thing is how important it is to get out there and do things like networking,
Mm-hmm.
to actually meet people. And again, one of the few things that lockdown has been an advantage for is made us triage our face-to-face stuff,
Yes, true.
and only do the stuff that is useful. But it also means that it feels quite special when you actually do go to one of these things now. Whereas these dreadful bio meetings where you're sort of schlepping around between cubicles for 8 hours a day for 3 or 4 days, and by the end of which you feel like you've aged 10 years. So I'm thinking about that because I'm going to the bio meeting in a couple of weeks in
Right.
Boston. But actually, it will be actually quite a special thing because
Yes.
I didn't go to one last year or the year before, and actually it means that the simple act of going there now means that it's a big deal. So
Yeah.
you're right. The guilt thing is very interesting, and I think that's one of the few consolations of getting older, is that you do start understanding what's important and what isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's an important one to learn, and especially because usually if you're the founder as well, you probably had to do everything at the beginning. So it's not just stepping into that role; it's also as your role transitions. But
yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and exactly that. And I think the other danger is that if you're a founder, is that you want to keep your fingers on everything.
Well, that's also true. Yeah.
And the question then is, well, okay, if you want to do everything, how are you going to recruit good people if you're not going to let them have freedom and do their own thing, and find satisfaction in what they do?
Yeah.
And so that's always the team thing, right? And it's one thing that medicine does teach you is teamwork, and how teamwork actually works where you empower somebody to do their job and to have agency over what they do, rather than have somebody at the top who wants to micromanage everything.
No,
and that's
absolutely.
another way of killing an organization, is by having a micromanager at the top. It just kills everything.
Yeah. And this leads us back to culture, of course. And you mentioned at the beginning that one of the attractions of this opportunity for you was being able to start with a blank piece of paper and really create that. So what has been your approach to that? What have been the principles around that? How have you approached building the culture?
Yeah, so at the beginning I wrote down there's a slide in our internal deck which is deliberately crappy, and it's a picture of Charlton Heston as Moses, with the 10 commandments, with the Arjuna commandments are
right.
And the commandments are: data drives us, we think about the patient, and no assholes. And those three are really important, because a lot of biotechs, they will try and make, and a lot of biology, and especially in academia, right? They will try and bend the biology, bend the data to fit their view.
True. Yeah.
And we've kind of taken the opposite effect, which is one of the things you can do when you've got sort of friends and family investors and you're moving slowly. You can let the data take you towards where you want to go. So that's been very helpful. The other thing is setting up experiments early on to tell you bad news early on. I think that's just the most difficult thing. It really is appalling. And every time you get a result that isn't what you want, biological result, I still lie awake at night worrying about it all. But because of the culture of the company, we don't have board members screaming at board meetings, "Why did this fail?" and pounding the table, which I have experienced, which is another way to kill a company.
Well, that's true, yeah.
And the thinking about the patient as well, because in our curious business, I mean, it's not like the thing is you read how to start a business up and blah blah blah, and they all talk about thinking about your patient. They're thinking about your customers first, and this is how Jeff Bezos became the Jeff Bezos we know, is because he was thinking about his customers. It's a curious business for us because the users of our products, the patients, aren't actually the customers who pay us.
No.
But at the same time, we need to be addressing the unmet need of our patients. And I think speaking to patients, getting involved in patient groups, and actually having had the experience of looking after people and being relatives of patients ourselves,
yes,
it's actually incredibly valuable because we understand what is actually necessary. For example, in a hospital, you sort of sit there and patients are delivered to you.
mm-hmm.
And it takes a while to realize that the patients don't actually want to be there.
Right.
For me, it was me going through with my dad's final illness, when he and I figured out that the thing that he really, really wanted more than staying alive forever was not to be going to the hospital.
Mm.
And that's interesting because then it makes you think, well, okay, what is our drug going to be then that will keep people away from hospital? And that's a very interesting thing.
Yes.
And so that's another thing that we are actively thinking about, and we've taken steps to get sort of patient representatives involved early, and that's been very valuable.
I was going to ask you about that because obviously
yeah.
you've lived that experience of having that patient contact. I suppose as you build the company, not everyone will have that.
Yeah.
That experience. So so patient representatives you've talked about. I suppose are there other things you've thought about as to how to keep that? Because I suppose in the early science, you're so far away from so many years away from the patient, right? It can be easy to lose track of that.
Yeah, totally right. And I think that the way that we're going to be addressing this, I mean, there's a really important question is by thoughtful recruiting and thinking about how we build up the medical team.
Mm-hmm.
So our next big hire is going to be a chief medical officer at some point soon, and that person I think has to be sort of interfacing with patient representatives and patients rather than just being there are obviously lots of different types of CMO.
Yeah.
But I think that's an important thing. And again, it comes down to culture, right? And it comes down to hiring the right person who's going to sort of fit in with all of that. And it comes to our third point, which is really underestimated how important this is the no asshole rule.
Mm.
So that's one of the things that I found really interesting about being in the States is that just the number of people who in US companies that think that it's okay to behave like an asshole.
Yeah.
And there is an asshole, the word asshole, and I use the American pronunciation because it's actually a technical term. And there's a book called The No Asshole Rule and the Asshole Survival Guide, which is the follow-up to it, written by somebody whose name I can't remember. The book's on my shelf behind me, actually, but I can never remember his name. And he says himself on the blurb of the second book, whatever I do in my life now, Stanford business professor, I am the asshole guy. And well, his thesis was that it is better to have no assholes in your company than to have high functioning assholes, because that it just kills everything. And I have to say I totally agree with that. My experience of all the various work environments that I've had, and you in some ways you can only implement that at the start.
Yes.
And people realize that there's zero tolerance, because certainly in biotech you're kind of going into battle, and most of the things you do are going to fail.
Right.
And that's the same for everybody. But the thing that makes a biotech succeed is riding through the failures and learning from them and failing less later on. And I think you need a specific mindset and group of individuals to actually achieve that. And I think that I think is the really important thing. And I think having group meetings that in Arjuna we have group meetings where we talk about data and really enjoy it, really challenge each other, understand that we can challenge each other and disagree, and it doesn't become a huge screaming match, because we the big strategic objective is the same. How we get there will be determined by what we do. So it's it's just another way of ensuring teamwork and not ignoring difficult truths early on. That's we're programmed to do that.
No, absolutely. And I think as you've touched on there, it's such a difficult business, right? And if you get people who are passionate about what they do, they're going to naturally be disappointed when things don't work. The last thing they need is someone blaming them for it, or you know, making a little comment, or those sorts of things. And that's, you know, that kind of thing may not seem like much at the time, but the accumulation of that will cause people to disengage, or it'll cause people to leave, or you know, and then
easy to say but very difficult to do.
I
mean, it's because you know, this is not, certainly isn't the area to go into if you want an easy life. No. But it's you know, I look at I'm old enough now that some of my banking friends have all either been sacked or retired.
Right.
And I'd much rather be them. That's the Freudian slip. I'd much rather be me than them.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, I would like to have all their money, of course, but day to day, and you know, using, you know, it's a privilege to be in a job where you can actually use your brain, right? I mean, it really is, because you look at I mean, that's another thing that medicine teaches you, because you look after people of all walks of life, and you realize how privileged you are to be able to do a job where you're actually using your brain and not sort of up a ladder painting, or, you know, doing something physical, or, you know, or have a condition that means that you can't work. So it is useful to think about how lucky we are that we're doing what we're doing, and also that what we're trying to do is actually worthwhile for society. And, you know, this isn't a monastic order. We're not doing this for the glory of our karma or God or whatever. We're doing this for money in the end, but doing it in a way that's hopefully going to benefit everybody.
No, absolutely. No, it is. It's a great position to be in. And tell us a little bit about what's next on the Arjuna journey.
Well, the idea is that we're going to be starting human trials next year. In Spain. So there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done before that, all the regulatory stuff and the manufacturing, etc. So we're just sort of figuring out now the group of lung cancer patients that we're going to start giving our drug to. We also have a really very successful collaboration with the University of Leuven, who are looking at glioblastoma, which is primary brain cancer. And in parallel, we think we're going to be able to do first in man or first in brain with them. And hopefully we can get some non-dilutive money from the EU for that. We also have a collaboration with the University of Tokyo.
Okay.
And the fascinating thing is that the spectrum of cancers in the Far East, what we call the Far East, is actually quite different. And so they're looking at their version of esophageal cancer and their most prevalent version of ovarian cancer. And they bear mutations that sensitize to AG5, our lead drug. So we think that's going to be a very big deal for us. But obviously, we're too small to do that on our own. So we're looking for a pharmaceutical development partner. There's also the China question.
Yes.
1 in 3 cancer patients live in China. It's a great place to do clinical trials, but there's obviously a Cold War going on at the moment. So how do we address that? And at the moment, we're not, but that's something that will happen when we get a bit bigger. And then there's radiotherapy, which is half of all cancer treatments in the world. And we're generating data with a consortium in the UK that makes us believe that we're actually going to be able to increase the therapeutic index of radiation. So not just amplify it, but actually make it safer. So the idea is that, you know, we've got this universe of potential things to do, a very limited amount of money, and we're trying to do this in an ordered, rational way, so that we can exploit all of these opportunities in a way that is that doesn't make us go bankrupt.
Yeah.
so we're doing this in an ordered way, and then we have and then we're going to start to build a footprint out in the US probably some point next year. And there's, I mean, the US is just so big and so interesting. There are lots of very, very interesting opportunities in the US.
Yes.
I mean, I have to say I'm a huge fan of the US, and I have to say if my wife didn't have the career that she does, we would still be living in California.
I see.
But it's not to say that it's second best being here. It's just different, and it's just a different way of growing a company. So it's and now if I was a VC, I would be concentrating early company development in Europe, but doing it in a way that is using that as an incubator for the US.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think just in terms of capital allocation. But the problem for VCs, of course, is you can't be everywhere.
No.
And it's much easier for them to be local for their investments. So I think that's going to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the world is going to become even closer than it is over the next 10 years, 15 years, whatever it ends up being, or maybe even less than that.
Yeah, and hopefully the China situation resolves in a constructive and rational way, because at the moment I think we are losing out a huge amount by not having access to Chinese patients, and they're losing out a whole lot by not having access to us. But it's I'm a Sinophile. My wife's family is Chinese, and I'm learning slowly to speak Mandarin, and I get a whole bunch of propaganda from my Chinese teacher about
right.
the evil West, and in some respects they have a point, but obviously it's a let's just say it's a difficult situation, but unfortunate. But I don't think it'll be forever.
No, absolutely. Well, Russ, it sounds like a really exciting time. There's obviously huge potential in what you're doing. We wish you the best of luck with it, and thank you for coming and talking to us today. Thank you. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much. Thanks very much for listening. Careers in Discovery is sponsored by Singular, helping you to build a brilliant biotech company. Biotech leaders spend far too much time, money, and energy on hiring and people issues. Head to www.singular-biotech.com to learn how you can recruit and engage your team more effectively, so you can focus on developing medicines, treating patients, and saving lives.